Hello again everyone and welcome back to the Underground. This is the Intel update for February 9th through the 15th, 2025. So let's get right to it. This week I thought I would take the opportunity to focus a little bit more and get a little bit deeper into the weeds on some of the topics that I covered this week in The Wire, because there have been a couple of things that may seem to be just like a basic news story, but I think are maybe a little bit more important than just that. So let's start things off by diving into the incident that occurred in Lincoln Heights, Ohio a few days ago. Now, this is a very, very inflammatory topic, but I think that despite all of the potential offenses people might have, I think it's worth talking about because this is a very, very important thing to remember moving forward. It's not just about this one specific area. I think that, just bottom line up front, this incident may occur in many, many other areas, as it has occurred in many other areas before. And I think that this could very well be a very big point for conflagration in some areas. So it's worth talking about some of these things right now. And when we get to the key takeaways, maybe you'll understand why. So for those who maybe have not heard about what happened in Lincoln Heights, Ohio a few days ago, a group of protesters, and I say that word protesters in heavy air quotes because I think there's a little bit more to the story than just that. Either way, a group of protesters who are self-described or at least self-portrayed as being either neo-Nazis or National Socialists of some kind. Either way, a bunch of guys wearing black and carrying swastika flags. These guys protested or demonstrated, I guess is probably the more accurate term because they're not specifically opposing a specific policy. I think it's more of a demonstration. We may, more doctrinally, we may call this a power projection operation, a way of projecting influence into a new area. So a bunch of these guys got together and decided that they wanted to go to one of the most ethnically black areas of northern Cincinnati and demonstrate. Now, as one might imagine, this did not go over very well at all. I do not know where they parked or where they were dropped off. I don't know very much about the initial incident because obviously this demonstration operation was not announced ahead of time. Either way, these guys were observed walking down the sidewalks through or adjacent to this area, and their mission, which has become quite popular in these sorts of circles, their goal was to put up signs and like zip tie or tape flags or whatever to the overpass, to the fence on the overpass, so that people traveling by on the interstate below would see their demonstration materials. Once again, this has become kind of a common thing. Now, I do want to issue a brief correction because at the time of this protest occurring, the initial media that came out, the photographs of the people who were taking pictures of these guys on the sidewalk, they were unarmed. So the people that I saw, the initial sourcing that came out, the primary sourcing, right, the on-the-ground first-hand account, seeing these guys, none of them had firearms. However, a few days after this initial protest action and the subsequent problems this caused, I did see, you can obviously very clearly see pictures of these guys, and some of them were armed. I don't know if they were all armed, but some of them were open carrying pistols and things like that. I do want to make that very, very clear right up front because this kind of matters in just a moment. But anyway, just for those of you who don't know, this is not illegal. No crime was committed by these protesters as far as I can tell. Of course, I'm not an attorney or anything, but these guys were on the sidewalk. They were not impeding traffic. Despite what their ideology is and the message they were trying to convey, it's not illegal, at least not yet. So that's pretty much how that went. They protested or demonstrated or whatever they were trying to do, put their signs up, and then they immediately left the area rather quickly, as you might imagine, because the nearby housing projects of hundreds, if not thousands, of people responded in force. Now, here's where things get a little bit interesting, because from what I can tell, and again, maybe somebody has some better sourcing out there than me, but I scoured social media, and I could not find a single instance of these guys walking through the projects with their flags. They looked to me like they were just on the freeway, on the sidewalks right there. So they didn't really go into the heavily entrenched housing project areas. However, that didn't seem to matter much because, of course, as many of you have already seen, the projects responded in kind and brought out a few hundred people, military-aged males, women, children, all armed with very interesting weapons, and they essentially created checkpoints. So as I'm showing you here on the map of the area, they created at least one checkpoint right here at the corner of Mangum Drive and Dorothy Court or Vision Way, essentially this large area here. And they also had a few people stationed up on the freeway, across the freeway. I have put pucks on the map for where I have video clips or images that went viral because of this. So for a couple of days after that initial show of force, initial demonstration, power projection, whatever doctrinal term you want to use, these dudes were hanging out here at this intersection with a lot of guns. And here is where things cross that magic red line into illegal land. Just like the initial protesters, right? Just like the initial demonstrators walking around open carrying in Ohio is legal. As far as I know, it's legal there. However, what is not legal is setting up a checkpoint and telling people to roll down their windows to check who's inside a vehicle, and then that person with the gun decides whether or not you can use a public road or not. This is a very, very big distinction. Standing on a sidewalk, waving a flag, no matter how interesting the flag may be, and how inflammatory it may be, it's still not illegal, as far as I know, in this country, to do that. It is, however, illegal to stop people at gunpoint and demand that only people with a certain ideology, or in many cases a certain skin color, can proceed on a public road. Now, this becomes a problem because not only is that illegal, but also look at where this is located. You can very clearly see this is a major highway. This is a major thoroughfare here, and this is not inside their community. This is a public road. This is not a private road. This is a major thoroughfare. This is a major industrial center here, right? This is not just some back road that these people have decided to set up checkpoints on. This is a big area. So that's kind of where things stand. Now, from my limited research on this, on social media, it looks to me like this whole thing's kind of over. As soon as the initial demonstrators left and tempers got inflamed, it's calmed down over the past few days. Plus, weather conditions have not been super great for standing out in the weather with a rifle. Anyway, once again, for those of you who live in Ohio and live near Cincinnati and you know of this area, I know I'm preaching to the choir on this. You guys know this is not surprising in the slightest. This has happened before. I'm fairly certain. Anyway, I just thought it to be very, very interesting because of some of the key takeaways that I brought from this incident, which is why I wanted to talk about it a little bit more. So why is this worth talking about? This seems like it's a one and done kind of, nothing bad happened, thankfully. Nobody got shot, even though the risk of that is still fairly high, just on a regular day. But why is this worth talking about a little bit more than just some, inflammatory protest? So the first takeaway that I wanted to mention is something that we obviously know, which is that there is a multi-tier justice system that is at play with things like this. And it's most palpable, it's most observable, like many things in life. When you go to the extremes of a situation, you find that you identify some of the problems that you may not have noticed in day-to-day life. But as shocking as it may be for some, it will not be surprising to many others who have been a victim of this multi-tier justice system over the years. This is very patently clear. I think it's very obvious, and I think that this is one of the issues that was on the ballot this past election. However, I did want to remind everyone that just because a national change of policy, a national regime change has occurred, and that there's been a lot of winning, quote-unquote winning, over the past 3 weeks or so, this does not mean that the situation will change overnight in many, many areas. Obviously, no law enforcement group in the country is going to tackle this issue. They're going to call this basically just hood justice and just kind of move on from there. Unless somebody gets hurt and or killed, in which case the response is going to be retroactive, right? Well, let's see what we can do about this after the fact. They're not going to take down a hood checkpoint. They're just not going to do that. Seeing what we learned from the Chaz and CHOP autonomous zones, or occupation zones in a few major cities around the country, and seeing how that all worked out, they're just not going to directly go after this sort of thing. It's not a realistic expectation. It may be a fair expectation, but it's not a realistic expectation. So the first thing is that this is a reminder that you can only get away with this kind of behavior if you are a protected group in society. So thing one. Point two is that a lawful protest, despite it technically being legal, doesn't mean it's smart. These guys who initially started this thing, they knew what they were doing. They knew they were going to go in there and they were going to poke and prod and they were going to agitate, and they were probably trying to get this response itself, and they got it. So is that a genuine method of swaying people to your side? No, generally speaking. Making people angry isn't going to really do a whole lot, unless the goal was just pure power projection, just to dominate and things like that. That could just have been the goal, and I don't know if they succeeded at that or not. Either way, just because a person does a protest does not necessarily mean that it's going to be risk-free or even a good idea. So this is something to remember. Once again, a lawful protest is a lawful protest. However, there are trade-offs, right? So this brought risk to the people around this area. If you had had a flat tire on that overpass when these guys walked up with their flags and the ghetto starts getting the hornet's nest gets kicked, I would be really, really, really upset if I was there trying to change my tire or having some kind of car problem or something, and I'm now in the middle of something that I didn't want to be in the middle of. Again, that's a what-if thing, but it's just something to keep in mind, right? The risks that these kinds of things bring. Thirdly, and second most importantly, I think, this has become a very big problem in the gun community, the gun world, and I don't have a solution for it, but I feel like this statement of fact needs to be stated, and it needs to be stated more often than it is being stated by 2A influencers. And this is that seeing a person displaying a firearm in public does not automatically mean friend. It does not. Not everyone who has a gun is a Second Amendment advocate. Spoiler alert, some people buy firearms legally to commit crimes with them. Some people buy firearms to hurt people with them. I know this may seem to be a surprising thing for the Second Amendment community, who seems to take the attitude that until the bullet clears the end of the barrel, no crime has been committed. This is not necessarily true, and is certainly not true in this case. What were these people doing? These people were pulling guns on people and saying, you shall not pass. They were saying you cannot go down this public street, this public highway, major public highway, unless you participated in our particular brand of ideology, okay? And if we go a step further, pulling a gun on somebody and saying you can't go through this checkpoint on this public street because you have the wrong skin color, hard no. That is very, very illegal. Okay, so they're already committing a crime. These people are not peacefully demonstrating. If they had not set up the checkpoints and they had just stood on the sidewalk with guns, there would be no crime being committed. But the Second Amendment community is so desperate to push something, which I'll get to in a moment, that they immediately see gun friend, and that's a huge problem. And this leads to the fourth and final point, which I think is the most important thing there is to remember today, which is why I wanted to talk about this, is that there are those in the Second Amendment community that do not understand point 3. And they will, and have openly stated that they will arm and train the people who openly state that they want to harm you, okay? Once again, I know that this sounds crazy once I put it like this, but there are a lot of people out there, especially a lot of companies, a lot of people who write books, a lot of people who are engaged very heavily in the Second Amendment community and things like that, that you look at their reaction to these kinds of incidents, and it's not a very positive look. I think that because the Second Amendment is such a strong, powerful thing in the conservative political realm in the United States, for some people, that Second Amendment is the most important thing in life. It's just the most important thing for them. It trumps everything. The Second Amendment is more important than their religion, their belief system. The Second Amendment is their core identity. And unfortunately, there's a warped understanding of it, which again is a debate for another day. But I just want people to take note. Take note of the 2A influencers, the companies especially, and see what they're doing. So I say all of that because I have seen a lot of 2A influencers, a lot of people who teach courses, pay attention, teach courses on these kinds of topics, and I really want to make people aware that getting education in the Second Amendment community is good. Learning how to use your tools is good. Okay, building skills is good, but you also have to remember that you may be giving your money to a company that has openly stated that they're going to aid and abet insurgents and terrorists on U.S. soil, because that's exactly what's happening here. People who come out who have companies that say, this is a great thing, this is a good thing, they ignore the fact that, one, this is not community defense, okay? you don't get to call it a community when it's a public resource, right? These people are guarding an on-ramp, off-ramp area, okay? This is not community defense. This is terrain denial, okay? Let's crack open those books that people claim to read and write so much. Terrain denial is a huge problem. Force projection is a huge problem. This is not community defense. This is not a peaceful protest. This is a crime. And so many companies came out and said, good for these guys, because they saw black guys with guns and they wanted to take an opportunity to not appear to be racist, and that's exactly what happened. Not realizing that these guys are openly committing crimes. They're checking vehicles and saying you can't drive on this road, you can't go through our, checkpoint. Do you see where this might be a problem? So look at the companies who are offering training to train these guys to be better, okay? I don't want to get too far into the weeds with this. I know we've got a lot more to talk about today, but I did want to just make everyone aware to be careful. Be careful who you're giving your money to, because you may show up to a training course and it may be all fine and dandy until you realize that these people also support and they're going to use your money. They're going to use your money to train the people who openly say they want to hurt you. And I think I'll just leave it at that. I know this is a very inflammatory topic. There's going to be a lot of tempers flaring on this one, but I did want to make that a little bit more clear, because this is not something that we can just sweep under the rug and pretend never happened. No, this is going to happen a lot more often. The South Africanization of the United States is already well underway, and this is something that is going to be hard for any national regime change to solve. And because of that, we've still got these local, mostly community-based problems like this. So I thought it was worth explaining a little bit more in depth. So let's move out to the Southwest and briefly talk about the situation on the border. Pretty much status quo. I'm still personally developing a lot of the things we may need to be aware of down there along the border. But one of the more geopolitical concerns that has arisen over the past few days is Mexico. The president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, deciding to threaten the United States with lawsuits because the United States wants to designate cartels as a terrorist or as terrorist organizations. I still don't know how that's going to work out. The United States has already decided to do this. However, if you look at the actual paperwork that Donald Trump himself has signed, it's not super clear as to how it's going to work out. You can obviously take it back. So the president of Mexico is acting as if this has not come into effect just yet. Dubious as to whether or not that's the case. But either way, the president of Mexico has essentially stated, and I want to be very careful to not straw man the Mexican government's position here. They do a fine job of doing that on their own. But from my understanding, the Mexican government's position is, well, if you designate these cartels as terrorist organizations, well, what we're going to have to do in response is use the United Nations programs that we get funding through and go after, use these laws that we have already written and the United Nations has written for us to go after, say, gun companies. So it's essentially, from what I understand, Mexico saying, hey, you want to designate our cartels as terrorist groups, we're going to have to go after the companies that made the guns that the cartels are using. We have seen this argument in the United States over the past few years, and it is a fairly bold argument with lots of audacity to bring in a legal realm. However, that's Mexico's position as far as I understand. Now, the reason that I wanted to mention this is because nearly 100% of Mexico's gun control efforts within Mexico come from the United Nations. The United Nations tells Mexico what to do with regards to gun control very clearly. This statement is backed up by Government Accountability Office, or GAO, reports over the past few years, which was essentially, for those of you who have not heard of the GAO, the Government Accountability Office was Doge before Doge. Wasn't very good, but still, it's an agency that does exist and did write a lot of reports in which they found that, basically, the United Nations is controlling Mexico's gun policy. Well, turns out that, very long story short, USAID was funding the United Nations gun control efforts, and which was in turn funding Mexico. So you have this circle where the taxpayer funds USAID, the American taxpayer funds USAID, USAID gives money to the United Nations gives money to Mexico to sue the United States. So this has become a huge problem over the past few weeks, as it has become very clear that the United States government is funding lawsuits against the United States government from other nations. So again, a continuation of the very interesting times we live in, but I didn't want to mention it because I thought it was kind of interesting. So moving out to another very, very interesting incident. This was the terror attack or grenade attack that occurred in the French city or town of Grenoble a few days ago. Once again, you guys can read the details on the wire if you want, but the short version is that somebody went up to a storefront in the town of Grenoble, threw a hand grenade through the window, and injured a lot of people. Casualty count so far looks like it's a couple of dozen people wounded. I don't know if there are any fatalities just yet, but when I was looking into this, I wanted to kind of briefly take you through the investigative process that I went through. As haphazard as it was, I was casually interested in this because of my own experiences, which I'll get to in just a moment. So let's dive into this case and let's see if we can try to figure out what actually happened here. So we hear about something occurring on social media, in this case a grenade being thrown into a bar, and what's the first step we want to do? Well, we want to find out where it is, right? So we hop ourselves onto whatever mapping service and we try to figure out, can we nail down where this attack took place? And in the hours after the attack, a word or a term kept coming up called, in French, and please forgive my pronunciation, but a lot of French reporters were calling this a bar associatif. Now, this is where my own personal bias comes in, or you might call it, instead of bias, experience. My spidey senses started tingling because I had heard this term before. Now, for those of you who do not know what a bar associatif is, in English it's associates cafe or associative cafe or associative bar or something like that. Now, what is this kind of establishment? Because when I hopped into Google Maps to initially search for bars in Grenoble to kind of figure out which street this occurred on, there weren't any in this area. This explosion took place in the old Olympic Village. The Olympics was held in Grenoble, I think in the 60s, 63 or 64 or something like that. And the old Olympic Village has become, well, we'll talk about that in a moment. Either way, there weren't any bars, no alcoholic serving venues anywhere near here. So indicator number one. So I did a little bit of research, and of course all of my French brothers and sisters out there maybe know immediately where I'm going with this, but a bar associatif, an associative cafe or associates cafe, is more akin to what you might call a lounge, more along the lines of a club, I guess as you could say it in English. Essentially, it's not a bar. They allegedly do not serve alcohol at this venue. This is one of those things in French culture which has become very, very popular, and we'll get to why that is in just a moment. So why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about bar associatifs? Why are we talking about my weird spidey senses? What's going on here? Like, why is this such an important thing that I find to be personally very interesting? Well, we'll get to that in a moment. Let's first get to the geolocation of evidence at the scene. Again, first step, figure out where it happened. And one of the first things that you try to do is take the images off of social media and what we call geolocation. Geolocate them, right? GeoGuessr fans will be very, very good at this. I am not very good at this, but essentially we're trying to figure out where images were taken or where the subjects of an image were. So this is my very rudimentary geolocation of the incident. This is a photograph that was taken by either a firefighter or a local responder at the scene. And on the left and on the right is Google Street View. So as we can see, I was able to geolocate where this image was taken. And once again, if we go back to the overall map here, I found where these victims were located here in the purple on the northeastern corner of this building here on Rue Claude Cogan Street, right? But as we can see, this does not jive with the images of the grenade blast. The grenade blast images, also on social media, showed a completely different place. One of these establishments has a storefront on the opposite side of the building here. So maybe you can start to piece together why I'm interested in this. Well, first of all, there's no street view of this particular establishment. There are no restaurants. There are no venues. There are no shops or stores or anything anywhere near this location, at least according to Google Maps. And this looks very clearly like a business storefront. This looks like a commercial downtown business area. Well, this plays into why I'm interested now, isn't it? So maybe we can start putting together what actually happened here and why these photographs don't add up or match up. What I personally think happened, and this is a little bit of speculation, but what I personally think happened is a grenade was thrown into an establishment on the inner courtyard here where there is no vehicle access, so you're not going to get Google Street View. It's only foot mobile. So someone threw a grenade into the inner courtyard here somewhere, and the survivors fled through the establishment out the back door, where we get the purple picture here. Now, this is kind of interesting to me because, like I said, there aren't any businesses here, at least according to the French authorities and Google Street View and Yelp and all these, places that track commercial venues. So what in the Sam Hill is this place? Like, what is going on here? It looks like a commercial venue, but there's nothing listed. So let's go back to the very beginning where I said that I had a little bit of spidey senses with regards to bar associatif. This is a screenshot from Google Maps that shows business affiliations or business licenses in the area. And right here, right through the building where the survivors of the grenade blast fled through, is an internet cafe. Now, internet cafes, for those of you who may be watching who are military targeting guys or did some time in the Middle East, you guys know immediately where I'm going with this. So let me just share a little bit of this background knowledge. So in the Middle East, obviously, one of the things that is pervasive to the third world is a lack of internet access and a lack of electricity, especially going back to the 80s and 90s. A lot of the Middle East is technically the third world, and in the third world, you tend to not have super reliable access to communications. So what did they do? Well, they set up these things called internet cafes. Now, again, we've had this idea here in the United States before, right? When the internet was kind of becoming a thing, 90s, 2000s kind of thing. It's like a coffee shop with desktop computers in it kind of thing. Internet cafe, it's not that uncommon. We have those here, even to this day. There's a difference, though. In the Middle East, they didn't ever really get rid of that cultural thing. So a lot of people who grew up in the Middle East in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, even though everyone in the Middle East nowadays has a smartphone, they really kind of stuck with the cultural thing of internet cafes being a huge thing. So again, why does this matter? Well, let me introduce you to a gentleman by the name of Osama bin Laden. Yes, during the 1980s, early 90s, a lot of Middle Eastern insurgents took advantage of the internet cafe to upload their ideology to the world. Many a copy of Inspire, Al-Qaeda's sort of like Time magazine, Al-Qaeda's version of Time magazine. Many a copy of these types of training materials was exchanged at internet cafes. So over the years, in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, in the Middle East, internet cafes became synonymous with things like headquarters, terrorist headquarters, insurgent communications hubs. A lot of IP addresses trace back to of distributed terroristic kind of content, which trace back to internet cafes, so that it's harder to trace who was actually there at a certain time, right? So let's bring this back to France. Why is France involved in all of this? Well, it turns out France is very, very, very much in favor of importing much of the Middle Eastern world into France, particularly in Grenoble. So if you were to zoom out or just take a little trip around Google Street View lane, you can look around the area and tell that the old Olympic Village in Grenoble is a very heavily Islamic, migrant-dominated area. Maybe not the whole Olympic Village, but definitely this area is very heavily Islamic, very heavily, Middle Eastern culture. And it turns out that going way back to the 80s and 90s, when you have a huge Muslim diaspora in a specific area, what do? You'll start seeing internet cafes pop up, because even if they have a smartphone, they use the internet cafe as kind of a way of having these community centers. Again, this is my personal bias or experience. You can decide, but my eyewitness testimony is that when I was doing targeting in Syria, Iraq, during the Operation Inherent Resolve mission, I would see an awful lot of intelligence gathered from places like internet cafes or community centers is what they were a lot of times called. And this is because a lot of IP addresses of things would trace back to these places. They're community hubs where people meet and exchange information. USB drives are handed off, cell phones are plugged in this place, and so on and so forth. It's sort of like finding, an Italian pizzeria in a New York City that doesn't actually sell pizza. It just becomes kind of obvious that it's a front for something. You may not be able to tell what it is, but it's definitely a front. So when I looked into this sort of grenade blast, a lot of people looked into this incident and said, okay, well, it's just a terrorist attack or something like that. This has become tragically common in France and throughout Europe and even in the United States. Grenade attacks are way more common in Europe than they are in the United States, obviously, but there's still not that much to it. Well, I looked into this, and the more I kept digging, the more confused I kept getting, and eventually, the less confused I got. So, what is going on at this location? I don't know, but I can tell you it's not just a terror attack. My suspicion, pure speculation, and this is also backed up by the French authorities, pure speculation is this was maybe a little bit of a turf war, maybe a little bit of a deliberate targeting between various insurgent groups who are upset that they have competition for various insurgent activities in an area. The French government clearly thinks this may be the case because they're not investigating this as a terror attack, they're investigating this as an organized crime incident. So what's the point of me talking about this specific area or this specific incident a lot in greater detail? Well, I think that I'm getting a lot of indications and warnings that this isn't just a simple terror attack. I think that this entire area is probably a hotbed for everything from human trafficking to drug trafficking to everything in between, right? Terrorism, if you want to call it that, whatever you want to say. I think that this is a very big area for that. We must remember that none of these businesses are listed on Google Maps. None of these businesses are listed anywhere. These are residential houses. These are residential apartment buildings that the ground floor of which has been knocked out and in a lot of cases and refurbished and retrofit, all without licenses, all without the French government saying that this can occur other than just them kind of ignoring it. And they've built essentially an entire society here. And this is the kind of thing that tends to pop up. You've got an associative bar here that is located at the exact same place or in the same vicinity of an internet cafe being listed. Now, I personally think they're the same business. I think they're the same place. But you see how this is really, really confusing. This is why you haven't seen a lot of French authorities. You can Google this story yourself. And even the French media, they don't really know what to do with this. They don't really know what to say because they're doing the journalistic thing. They're not doing the intel thing. They're doing the journalistic thing where they try to find out, okay, where did the blast occur? And you can see them in the way that they're writing it. They don't have details, so they just speak in generalities. And you can see they don't know what's going on here. But what I think is going on here is this is probably an illegal business that got attacked in some kind of turf war or something like that with a grenade. It's located very close to a internet cafe, which means probably very close to some kind of command element, some kind of mover or shaker, some powerful person who needs a comm center, who needs a communications hub, a C2 node, command and control node, and I think that's why this attack occurred here. I don't think it was a random act of violence. I think it was very targeted because other probably Islamic-based groups knew that this is a very important building. This is a very important place. But because the journalists don't know this history of internet cafes and associative bars and things like that, in France, the only time the French people hear about these bar associatifs is when they get caught running illegal cigarettes without paying taxes, or they get caught up running like things like that, or like a hookah bar, which is like a front for something. They don't look into it from an insurgent perspective. So again, my mind going there immediately is definitely a bias because this is my work history, and I find it to be very, very interesting that this is now occurring in France. So again, I know probably way more information than a lot of you were expecting on this. I don't know how many of you will find it interesting, but I certainly found it to be absolutely fascinating, and if not rather unfortunate that these kinds of things are now happening in France. Very sad to see. But that's pretty much all I have on this. I'm going to do a little bit more digging and see if I can figure out who's the mover and shaker in this area. I've already identified a few names, but I'm not confident enough in what I've got so far. But I did want to just kind of share this and show that it's not as simple as you might imagine, and some of the investigative processes that you have to go through to kind of get to the bottom of what's going on here. And in many cases, you can't get to the bottom of something, but you can get to a point to where you realize something shady is going on here, and that's kind of where I'm at with this. So that's pretty much all I have for now. Let's talk about some of the GhostNet reports. Again, very good week for GhostNet. A lot of you out there testing. I saw a few of you mention, I didn't get screenshots of it, but I saw a few of you mention the Meshtastic options. I think a few of you out there are using the Meshtastic line of sight only channel node that I've set up in the GhostNet plan. I will have more on this at some point and how to get all that set up, but I think that's kind of interesting. I think that's a pretty good thing. I have not heard anybody use the GhostNet Meshtastic channel in my area, but then again, I'm also kind of in a black hole for communicating with Meshtastic sometimes. So I thought it was very interesting that other people are getting some use out of it. So thank you guys for that, and I'm hoping that it helps. But other than that, yeah, just standard kind of news reports. Very helpful for a lot of people out there. I know that a lot of people are listen only and receive only. So just be mindful that, if you're pushing a news report out or a local story or something like that that you think that may need to be covered a little bit more and it's in your area, feel free to talk about it, because I'm sure there are a lot of people. It would be impossible to determine how many people out there are listening to certain transmissions that are being made. So it's both good and bad, but when it comes to the exchange of news, it's just something to keep in mind. So that's pretty much all I have for today. Here are the sources as usual. Thank you guys all for sticking with me with some of these more rabbit hole kind of conversations, and thank you for bearing with me as I get down in the weeds with some of these things. But all of this doesn't really matter like a lot. Not really. It's more of a case of being aware that you can get down in the weeds with some of these incidents, and I think that it may help to do so just so that you can have a better framework for understanding other things that pop up in due time. So thank you guys all for watching. Thank you for all of your support. I think I'll cut it there for today, and so thank you once again, and I will see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.